I'm live, apparently. So, welcome everybody to my presentation about a little bit of language love, or how a little bit of linguistics can make your walk go a long way. I'm having my phone here, so I've got the online viewers here as well. I can't promise that I'll keep track of everything you're saying, but do know that you're also part of this wonderful experience. And now that we are actually talking about this experience, I want everybody to give a big shout out to Sydney and his team for organizing this, because it's just so amazing to see so many of you here live. So give it up. Thank you so much, Sydney. I hope that kind of reached him, because he seems really busy. Anyhow, let's get this started. For those of you who don't know me, I am one of the Micahs. I live in Hilversum, and that's also the place of Indy, the chatbot that I'm working on right now with, one of the loveliest conversation design teams ever. I promised them a little shout out. So if you're listening, hi there, wonderful, there they are. When I'm not designing conversations or optimizing NLU or just, consulting or anything, I love building communities. I'm very much involved in the Dutch Women in Conversational community. And quite recently, I started Convo Club, which is a friendly and knowledgeable community for conversation designers and people who work in conversational AI. You're all very welcome to join. It's very gezellig. Right. And so, this talk is going to be about linguistics. But before we dive into the details, let me just briefly explain a little bit about what linguistics actually is. When you ask me, hey, Mike, what's linguistics? I usually say, well, it's the structured study of language, but it is also the study of language structures. And as such, there's not just one linguistics. There's a whole range of topics, of areas, of subjects that fall under the umbrella of linguistics. And this circle just explains this really beautifully. It's not mine. I found it on the internet, but I love using it. So if anybody knows who created this, let me know, and I'll pay proper credits. If you look at the center of language, it starts with sounds in a very broad sense, because signs also are kind of sounds, just not acoustic. And the wonderful thing about sign language is that it actually behaves like any other natural language in terms of linguistics and language structures. So that's it's an important point to make, I think. Phonetics is really about the acoustics, so that is really about, sound production, sound reception. And phonology, which is my big love, is very much about units that are higher, more broad than single sounds. So intonation, rhythm, meter, sentence melody. And if you map that onto conversation design, that's where you find automatic speech recognition, speech synthesis, and SSML, of course. If you ever work with SSML and you have the prosody tag, that's where you find a lot of phonology going on, pitch, intonation, stuff like that. If we move a bit outward, we enter the realm of words and sentences. So morphology is very much about single words, how you can glue them together. If you speak Dutch, you know that words can just go on and on and on and on and on. And that's sometimes a bit of a pain for NLU, because how many entities are there in a word can be quite a few. And syntax, which will be the focus for today, is more about sentence and sentence structure. And this is what can help you as a conversation designer to kind of work with your intent a little bit. But there's more. I mean, that's what the beauty of linguistics. It just spans almost everything. Semantics and pragmatics, and that's where the challenging part comes in. This is about meaning, about coherence, cohesion, things that large language models struggle with quite a bit. And I'm just so curious what will happen here in the next few years, because who knows? Wie het weet mag het zeggen, zou ik zeggen. And pragmatics, it's a very broad categorization. I know that for the linguists in this room, this is probably very overgeneralized, but just to give you kind of an impression, that's where conversation analysis lives. That's where meaning, actually in the context of discourse lives. It's about nonverbal communication, stuff like discourse markers, And as such, I think it's already quite clear why it is so handy to have a linguist on your team, because they can basically help you with anything. And I haven't even touched on things like computational linguistics or historical linguistics, which is also really interesting. So, how does this tie into my topic for today? Well, let's do a sanity check. Does this sound familiar? Probably does. You start building your first chatbot, you've got your budget, you've got your use cases right, you've got everyone on board, you've got the best platform out there, and you start building, and you add a few intents, and yay, you've got success, it works. And you analyze your bot every day because that's what people tell you to do, and of course you want to do it the right way, and you keep adding these new intents, and one day you wake up, and you get this very strange answers to very normal questions. I hope Jeroen will forgive me. This is Anna from ABN AMRO. This happened in test, but it's just such a beautiful example. Anna, she works really, really well, and she asks, hey, how can I help you? And I'm saying, ik ga verhuizen. I'm moving house. And Anna, the sweetheart that she is, says, welterusten, good night. And this example is just too beautiful not to use, because this happens to all of us, right? And this is where you usually call your software supplier, and they're like, yeah, duh, you should train your bot. And then I'm like, who dan? But how? Because everybody keeps telling me to train my bot, but it's not that easy, is it? Or is it for you? Hands for everybody who finds it easy to train your bot? No, thought so. So before we kind of go into the nuts and bolts on how to do this and how linguistics may help you, it might actually be really a good thing to realize what you're doing when you train an intent. Because basically what you're teaching it is not to speak human or anything. You're just giving it examples of user questions. And this we know, of course. But you're also training your language model which words can appear where. So in that way, it's actually almost like your entire utterance is a sequence of slots, or your intent is a sequence of slots, not just the ones we use for slot filling, but basically any position in a sentence can be filled. And training your bot teaches it how to do that in a meaningful way that helps recognition. So examples of word orders, and especially in languages that depend heavily on fixed word orders, this is important. And also which words are within the scope of an intent. And this is, of course, really important to prevent two intents from kind of bleeding into each other. And this is where a little linguistics can definitely help. Put 4 tips together for you. I won't address them here because we're going to dive straight into them, because time-wise, we're halfway. That's fine. This one might sound like an open door, but tip number 1 is actually to balance the number of utterances over your intent set. Can you imagine what happens if you have one intent with 500 examples and one intent with 5? It's just a matter of logistics, isn't it? There's just so much more opportunity to hit an intent with 500 examples. And chances are that even the utterances that are part of the very small intent will still end up in the big one, because it's what we call a greedy intent. So this is something that's quite easy to do. And of course, people always ask me, what's the ideal number of utterances per intent? Honest answer, I don't know. Because I typically work with Dutch, with different NLUs than English speakers. So it really depends on a lot of factors here. So for Dutch, I usually aim for at least 30, because that gives me enough playground to do the things that I'm going to talk about later on. Also, ideally, only include utterances of 3 words or more, but even this depends on the platform that you use, because 3 words will give you actual user questions rather than keyword searches. And of course, try to use real user data as much as possible, with a big caveat there, a big, well, pay attention, because it's not as easy. Nothing is easy here. That makes it so much fun. One other advantage of paying attention to this is that if you have an intent with very few utterances, you might even wonder, do I need this intent? If I can find so few examples of this intent, might it not be better off, placing it in another intent or merging it? Tip number 2, clean your utterances. topic of much debate, I know, but for me this works. And by cleaning your utterances, I mean remove those words that are not relevant to the intent. NLU will do a part of that for you, like many NLUs will remove certain stop words or interpunction, but chances are that there's still quite a few words that remain that might not be relevant. And before you start doing that, it's important to realize that ideally you should work with two sets of utterances, two sets of training examples. One to actually train the language model of your chatbot, and that's to make sure that it functions to the best of its ability. And the other one you reserve for testing it against the outside world. So actual user questions that are asked by actual people that actually use your bot. Actual is my favorite word, did you notice? So for the first set, the training set, I clean my utterances. And for the second one, I try to keep them as natural and lifelike as possible. And it's quite important to not let them overlap so that you keep them really kind of separate. Now, here's an example of a typical question that I see in my chatbot data analysis. Good morning to you. I would really like to know how I can open a bank account with your bank. My granddaughter is a very satisfied customer. Now, chances are that good morning might kind of lead your chatbot to a welcome intent, because, of course, good morning is a greeting. So I remove everything that might be part of another intent to prevent overlap. My granddaughter is a very satisfied customer. Chances are that the bot might actually think, hey, you want to open a bank account for your granddaughter? Sure, I can do that. So anything that might cause confusion in the meaning of the intent, I also remove. Depending, again, on the platform and the language that you use, you can go even further. I try to remove any verbs that don't have to do anything with the intent. Auxiliary verbs, so verbs that carry little meaning, like will, would, could, should. Depends. Try it out and see what happens. This one is interesting. The original title of this tip was Use Naming Conventions, and then I realized that many companies use numeric naming conventions for their intents, like coding names. But what I really like, even though it might not be manageable for very large bots, is at least start with intents that actually reflect the task or the problem that users want to achieve or solve. Using naming conventions for your intents obviously solves the problem of what did I put where. Anything above 10 intents is kind of hard to manage if you don't do this. But the beauty of using natural language for defining your intents is that you're actually doing a bit of domain modeling. So you're modeling your customer's world, you're making sure that you're using their words, and you're also kind of sparking a discussion or a debate with your colleagues, like, hey, are these actually two intents, or are we using different words for the same one? So this is something I would definitely recommend, even just as an exercise. How would you define your intents in terms of natural language? And again, language patterns can help you here. Because if you look at most intents, what are they? Actions that people want to take, problems that people want to solve, or goals that people want to achieve. And these are all kind of I eat an apple, subject, action, verb, direct object, who does what, and most intents are actually action, verbs, and direct objects. So this is basically back to secondary school, I guess, or even primary school. Do a little bit of language parsing, and this will really help you. So if you look at different flavors of intent, it works for all of them, like task-oriented intents, buy book, order food. Topic-oriented intents are much more about information requests about a certain topic, show opening times, give location directions. And even for system intents, so the intents that you don't use for your customers, but more for system logic, I guess that most developers, I'm not telling anything new here, right? It's, get username. It's something you see quite often. And I think this might already be the last one. How am I doing time-wise? Oh, that's really cool. Almost done. Use enough utterance variation. The challenge for most of us is how do we define our intents broad enough to catch as many user questions, but how do we define them narrow enough to make sure that they hit the right intent and don't go to another intent? And language patterns can be really helpful in balancing the variety and the consistency that you both need. But for this, you actually need an in-depth analysis of each utterance that you put in your chatbot. It's a lot of work, but it really pays off. Now, here is an example intent, show store location. And just to give you a taste of what kind of patterns are here, I start with the verbs. So there's give, find, locate. So they're all kind of centered around the central theme of this intent, show location. So my tip here would actually be, or my tip for you would be, don't use too many different action verbs in one intent. And if you do, make sure that they're somehow related or synonymous to each other. So that way, each intent is kind of focused on one core action or one core goal. And another tip is to actually put the verb into various positions in your training material, your utterances, so that you teach your bot where these verbs can occur, because it can't really figure that out itself in many cases. Then I go on to the nouns. There's one noun cluster here for directions, so directions, route. There's one for address, location, and there's one for store. Well, as you can see here, there's actually a bit of an overrepresentation for store here, so that might actually get hit a lot, whereas business or your company are kind of underrepresented. So here, to get the balance right, I would add a few more businesses and companies and perhaps get rid of some of the store examples. And here again, put it in different locations, and this way you kind of give your NLU the possibility to train and also recognize new verbs and new patterns. And the last one, sentence structure. If you look at the different types of sentences that we've got in this intent, you find some WH questions, so where, what, know when, because this is not an intent about time. There's some how questions, how do I do this? There's imperatives or commands, location please. And there's some statements, or what we call declarative sentences, which are not even questions, but people just state their intent directly. And again, by adding a bit of each of these patterns in your intents, you're kind of giving it the glue that kind of solidifies everything and brings it together really nicely. And my final tip is to actually forget about all this, because this is my experience for my language and the platforms that I work with. The only thing that you can do is try, keep trying. Again, there's some software out there that can help you, but even then, you need to understand how this is working and why it works or not. Keep analyzing and validating. This is just the never-ending story, but in a positive way. Keep optimizing and find out what works for you. And with this, I conclude my presentation. Thank you so much. Do we still have time for one or two questions? No, it's actually 10 past. One question. Go ahead.
Really interesting. In that last example where you're going through the questions about the location, is it worth you just doing that yourself manually in Notepad, because you know you'll get the best quality because you're going through that, or using a tool at least to do some of the annotation to pick out those different verbs, the nouns, etc.?
I am teaching myself Python, so I can do this in a more organized way, but it's not necessary, especially when you create your intent. Just simple search actions can also do the job. And of course, this is geared towards people who don't have data scientists in their team, don't have the fancy equipment or the coding abilities. So it's very much about the principles. But yes, absolutely. I mean, any text mining can help here, with the risk that it can also miss certain labels for sure. Yeah. Oh, I have to stop, unfortunately, but I'll be online and I'll put off my shoes and be thankful it's over.